Wonhyo&Uisang, and I'm a professor of Korean cultural tourism at Namseol University down in Chungcheongnam-do currently. I've been in Korea for about 30 years, been involved with Korean Buddhism and doing a wide variety of research works on traditional Korean culture. Wonhyo&Uisang are some of my favorite characters that I've studied over the years and experienced their places, and so that's why I chose this as the theme for today's talk. As such, I've written a variety of books about Korea's culture and tourism and cultural history, you might say, and in particular the upcoming Encyclopedia of Korean Buddhism, in English, which we hope to have out by the end of this year. And this talk was originally scheduled to help promote the book after it was published, but it's not published yet. The usual delays of publishing. So we're today going to present about two of the greatest, you could say, heroes of Korean Buddhism, and known as cultural heroes of Korea altogether. Names that all Koreans know, even if they have no other interest in Buddhism, but people know these, and in particular one of them, very proud of them. And they are even internationally known figures, at least within East Asia, within the Buddhist tradition for well over 1,000 years. Famous people, and they go together. They're often, I've often seen talks, presentations, events on one of these figures or another, and it always strikes me that you can't really talk about one of them without talking about the other one. The two of them go together as kind of a yin and yang, as we say in Korean, yang, matched pair, that they are very different from each other, kind of opposite in their character, but they are both essential and both highly enlightened figures, both very important to the history of Korean Buddhism, just in different ways. And they worked together, cooperated together, but coming from different angles. It's like one of those Hollywood buddy cop movies of people with different personalities and characters that seem to clash, but they work together to accomplish something great in the end. These two, first of all, to point out a bit of vocabulary, and this is one of the entries from the encyclopedia I've been working on here, Doban. If nothing else, this is a good piece of vocabulary to pick up about Korean Buddhism and such. It means a fellow practitioner, a Dharma friend. A friend. Do is the Tao, a pathway, a way to go, within Buddhism usually interpreted as the pathway towards enlightenment, that we are all more or less treading together, some faster, some slower, and various side paths, but the general pathway towards Buddhahood. And then Ban, a friend or fellow along the way. And so to be a Doban is really a wonderful thing. It's a friend in the Dharma that you have, somebody who's on the path with you, helping you, inspiring you, and kind of taking care of each other, fairly literally like fellow pilgrims on a pilgrimage road towards the great final shrine and such, assisting each other in every way to get along the road as various things come along. A Doban. And there are other terms that Koreans use in here. Sunu, a good friend, of a virtuous friend along the path, and babu, a Dharma friend, literally a friend in the Dharma, other paths. But Doban. And Wonhyo&Uisang, these 2 months, they were Doban. They were together pretty much all their life that we know of them. ever since they became monks, they were friends, they remained friends all their life and had many interactions. And this is partly why you can't really consider one without considering the other, why they have to be talked about together. So many of the things that happened, they did together, and there are many kinds of folklore stories about them together and what they did from their different personalities, different angles. Kind of the theme of my speech here is how they're opposite sort of characters, or at least differing characters, and different ways of getting to enlightenment, and then different ways of expressing that enlightenment, practicing and furthering Buddhism, and leaving quite different legacies. But like a yang, like a yin and yang, like in the Taeguk figure, both are essential, both ways. You can't really say that one way is better than the other. They both had essential results for making Korean Buddhism what it is today. Both of these men are really right at the foundation of Korean Buddhism. They appear early in the story of Korean Buddhism, and as it is really becoming Korean, just after the initial stage of opening, and as it really begins to become a Korean tradition and not just an imported religion. We have to consider, first of all, just to say, the context, the historical context of which they were operating in. Buddhism came to Korea just before 400, in the late 300s or so, coming up from China, from the missionaries that had come across from Central Asia. Some of these were Chinese missionaries, some were Central Asian missionaries that came up here bringing the Buddhism. It was a simple Buddhism compared to what we know now. You might hate to use the word primitive, but simple, rather elementary. Buddhism had just come into China for a couple hundred years and was just getting established, really, with major problems of translation. The Buddhist philosophy coming in from India, written in Sanskrit or Pali or some Central Asian languages, very difficult for the Chinese to understand. A completely different kind of language, really, being involved, and getting it into Chinese characters, very, very difficult. For hundreds of years, they worked on simply problems of translation and just understanding what this Buddhism was all about. They did not, literally, they did not have the proper vocabulary in Chinese for many of the Buddhist terms, and so new vocabulary had to be invented and dictionaries written and vocabulary terms borrowed from Confucianism and Taoism, which kind of had a different ideas, but then applied and with a struggle to understand. So the Buddhism was simple, as I say, and largely involved with the worshipping of idols, of statues, and of understanding long periods of study to try to understand very abstruse philosophy arguments that had come in translated into Chinese characters. And for the Koreans especially, they had just been adopting Chinese characters themselves, and Chinese characters have nothing to do with the Korean language. There's no relationship, and therefore they're trying to understand ideas from India passed through Chinese characters and then to Korean people who are having enough trouble just reading simple Chinese. This is all very difficult. It was mainly a religion of faith and of worship, and a belief in magic and miracles is littered all through it, just simply showing the power of the Buddha, that the Buddha is a great figure. It was also very government focused by this time, a kind of thing which we could refer to as a corruption. The idea that Buddhism was supporting the government, supporting the state, in state formation, as we say. They're supporting the building of kings and kingdoms. The king himself, if he supports Buddhism, then the monks regard him as a Buddha. And the king's commands become the same as a religious command of the Buddha. They even had a whole sutra called the Wonhyo&Uisang, the Benevolent King Sutra, which lays out all this of how Buddhism supports the government and government supports Buddhism, and everybody's happy. As you can tell, this is not pretty much anything close to what Sakyamuni Buddha was teaching in India, and had become something very distorted and corrupted. It took a long time in China for things to settle down and for the Buddhist ideas to be really understood and to begin to flourish. I will posit that the Chinese really, Chinese and East Asia altogether had a very different way of thinking altogether than in India. A different way of thinking, a different way of expressing. In particular, that the Indians like to go on and on and on and on and on with their philosophy. They like long books, the longer the better, writing endless reams of text and long lectures and very long analytical philosophical arguments. The Chinese like to be as brief as possible. The great Chinese texts, like from Confucius and Lao Tzu, are really very short, with the famous Tao Te Ching, only 5,000 characters. The Chinese like to put it very briefly. We have a good example of this in the Heart Sutra that we just chanted to open this up. It's a summary of what was originally 10,000 pages of wisdom sutras, the Prajna Paramita, endless argument. Logical argument to try to prove the nature of reality and show wisdom coming out of there. And in China, in particular, they cut it down and condensed it and summarized it until we end up with a one-page version here, the Heart Sutra, which everyone over here very much likes and considers central. Just reducing 10,000 pages to one. The less words used, the better. Now, we get to this with Wonhyo&Uisang in just a minute, their role in this. But there's a whole different way of thinking, different way of expressing. And so what happened then is by about 500, you start getting Chinese versions of Buddhism. Due to the problems of translation, the different cultural context, different cultural values, and a whole different way of thinking and way of expressing, they start making really their own schools of Buddhism, based mostly on the sutras that come from India, but interpreting them, commentating on them, making their own interpretations, their own schools based on those sutras that become very different from the way India is thought of and practiced back in India or Central Asia. Okay, new schools of Buddhism are, first of all, the Tiantai school, which in Korean is Chuntae. During the 500s, the 6th century, 500 to 600, becomes very popular and strong in China. It's a unique Chinese version of Buddhism that attempts to bring all the different kinds of scriptures and different teachings coming in from India, which seem very diverse and at loggerheads with each other, contradicting each other, and competing, each sutra claiming to be the supreme wisdom. And Chuntae puts it together as a system of understanding Buddhism, that with an organization of the sutras on different levels and different ways of understanding, so that this is how the Chinese begin to make sense of this. Also, just after 500, Bodhidharma appears in China and makes what we now call Zen Buddhism, Korean Sun Bulgyo, Japanese Zen Chan Buddhism, as a whole radical departure, and partly a reaction to the over-proliferation of scriptures and sutra, too many pages to read, too many different ideas trying to understand, and Bodhidharma comes along and says, throw it all away and just sit down and meditate. And through direct meditation and mind-to-mind transmission, we get it. This suits the Chinese really much better than the South Asian, Central Asian way of practice and understanding. Then Huayan Buddhism crops up. The Tiantai Buddhism, known in Korea as Chuntae, has had very successful during the 500s, and China gets reunited China was broken up into many different kingdoms, many of which adopted Buddhism and different Buddhist schools, but China does come together at the end of the 500s, 589, gets reunited, and they like the Chunte school of Buddhism. They adopt that as official way, a kind of an overall, overarching vision of Buddhism. But then this was the Sui dynasty that reunited China. They went to war against Korea, against Goguryeo, the Korean kingdom, and they lost catastrophically, lost everything, and Tiantai Buddhism went down with them, went down with the Sui dynasty. It failed in only 25 years after having accomplished the great reunification of China. 25 years it was gone, and because it was the official Buddhism of the Tiantai or Chunte Buddhism failed with it. And the Tang dynasty formed in China, the Tang dynasty, and by the early 600s, and they adopted, first of all, Taoism. The early Tang emperors favored Taoism, Dogyo, and Buddhism didn't do so well, had a setback. But by the middle of the 600s, Buddhism made a comeback, had some royal support, and in particular, a powerful queen favored the new Huayan school. Huayan, or Huayan, it's pronounced. And that in Korea is Hwaom Bulgyo. And today's story is a lot about how that gets established. That becomes the new kind of Chinese Buddhism that flourishes in China with royal support, and then is transferred to Korea and becomes really a mainstream for hundreds of years, one of the main kinds of Korean Buddhism, with the support of these two gentlemen talking today, Wonhyo&Uisang. Okay, there's some context there. For Korea, we talk about Korea having certain golden ages, great times in Korean history where culture and art flourished, and Korea was doing well with prosperity and was a great nation. And then in between those, we can identify 4 golden ages so far in Korean history. And in between those golden ages, of course, are bad times, dark ages, times of failure and collapse and such. The first golden age of Korea generally is about 600 to 800, roughly, going very roughly. Just kind of estimating for convenience. 600 to 800, about 200 years, Korea enjoyed a glorious time of just getting going with 3 major kingdoms formed by that time, and having adopted Buddhism in the 400s or 500s, those 3 kingdoms, and also build up their power. By the 600s, they were flourishing culturally with lots of education, lots of great artworks beginning to be done, native Korean stuff that still today, if you visit the ancient kingdom of Gyeongju, this is where all these great artworks and monuments begin to appear. And late in the 600s, almost halfway through this first golden age, there's a great war of unification. And the war does not destroy everything, thankfully, but it does wreck 2 of the 3 kingdoms, and one kingdom, the Shilla kingdom, takes over, unifies 2/3 of the Korean peninsula, makes kind of Korea as we know it today. And then after that, unified Shilla, as we say, for about 100 years, into the 700s, unified Shilla flourishes gloriously as a very rich, wealthy kingdom with philosophy and art and religion and great accomplishments and strength. Wonhyo&Uisang are just perfectly positioned there to be right in the middle of, and to be great progenitors of this first golden age. They're both born in the early 600s. They're born, they're young men, they're young boys, when already their kingdom of Shilla is coming up already in the world, getting prosperous, getting rich, getting strong, and expanding its territory while they're young men. So a feeling of great optimism and confidence in the air back then. And both of them live right through the unification wars. They both achieved enlightenment just before the wars of unification, just around that time. They're getting enlightened while everyone else is fighting and killing and such, and becoming great masters, so that when the wars are over and Korea is the unified Shilla kingdom is beginning to flourish again as a unified thing, they are both then senior masters, fully enlightened and ready to go to be leaders of the new society that is formed, and to making reconciliation with the conquered lands, the part of the Baekje and Goguryeo areas that were conquered by Shilla and had to be assimilated together in a new nation. Both Wonhyo&Uisang worked there to reconcile with those people, bring them together under the name of Buddhism, under the ideology of Buddhism, bring it together with a feeling of one country under one kingdom, that they could work together. So then Wonhyo died by the end of the 600s, just soon after the unification. Uisang made it to the early 700s to really be able to powerfully establish the new Buddhism all over the new unified kingdom. Okay, so that's kind of the role they play. That's the context we're in here. Are you with me so far? Any question or confusion of that? The general context. Okay. Now, Wonhyo&Uisang are Doban together, brother monks. They are searching for the proper way of enlightenment. They both studied the mind-only school, which is a kind of intensively intellectual, philosophical sort of Buddhism that had been coming in with the new scriptures and such. But neither one of them got to the really high level of, got enlightened or a high level of understanding through it. They resolved to go to China They resolved to go to China just at 661. 661. This is just when Queen Sunduk and Jinduk had finished their reigns and had built up Korean Buddhism, built the power of the kingdom. They had just died, and King Muriel took power and was really made Shilla a large, expanded, powerful kingdom. And just when King Muriel died and King Munmu took power, the one who would accomplish unification, the two of them finally made their trip to China. They tried 10 years before, during the reign of King Muriel, 10 years before, I'm mixing up here, so say, first of all, 10 years previous, 651, sorry, 651. They tried to go to China, the two of them together, overland, and around by the Liaoning Peninsula, they are arrested by the Goguryeo kingdom and thought to be spies. And then they could have been executed. And it's not unreasonable to think, there were not that many travelers in those days, except Buddhist monks and merchants and official emissaries of kinds. And Buddhist monks were often, bringing information, exchanging information as travelers between the different places where they went. And they could very easily be spies for their home kingdom. They would be good at it as educated men and such. So they were held, and they were finally judged to not be spies and were sent back to Shilla, where they continued their studies and waited for another chance. 661, just before the real wars of unification get going, they traveled to China again. And they had to cross the neighboring enemy kingdom of Baekje to do this, so it's not so easy. Again, they could have been arrested, but they weren't. They made it across Baekje to the west coast of Korea, the place that's now called Dangjin, which means the port for the Tang dynasty. It's in Chungcheongnam-do, just south of Seoul here on the west coast. It's the main port where you go back and forth to the Tang dynasty to the Shandong Peninsula across the Yellow Sea. So they're going over there to take a ship. What results is probably the single most famous story of Korean Buddhism, the most famous story we have, and it is, and it's a fun story, and widely celebrated, and as I'll show you, many artworks about it around here. And it's kind of a key story of Korean Buddhism, perhaps, and shows the beginning of the yin-yang relationship of difference between Wonhyo&Uisang. The story goes that they arrived at the coast in the evening and they're looking for the ship, but the ship wasn't there yet. And then heavy clouds are coming in and it starts raining. And there by some, hills by the side of the coast, they don't know what to do. They find a cave, and it's dark, it's midnight, they can't see, but there's a cave inside, and anyway, it's dry, it's out of the rain, and so they say, okay, let's sleep here. It has a bad smell, kind of a funny smell, but they ignore that, and they say, let's just sleep here tonight. And they're sleeping, and it's dark midnight, about 3 a.m., and Wonhyo wakes up with a terrible thirst, a real painful, sometimes how it is, a real cotton mouth thirst where he really needs some water, and he hears a dripping sound over to the side, and he thinks, oh, there's a cave, the water source. He feels his way over there, and he finds a cup. His hands, he feels, it's total darkness, but he feels a cup, and there's water inside of it. And he says, oh, what good fortune. There's water dripping into the cup, and so he picks this up, and he drinks the water, and he thinks, oh, that's good, that's delicious, fine, sweet. And he feels satisfied, and he lays down to go to sleep. Fine. Then it's 6 a.m. in the morning and sunlight comes streaming in. Wonhyo&Uisang, they both wake up and they look around and they see skeletons around them, human skeletons. They realize that, oh no, this is not a cave or not just a cave, it's a tomb. It's an old tomb cave where the dead bodies have been interred and such. And Wonhyo looks over and finds that this cup that he had drunken from was the top part of a human skull. It was tipped over and such. It was a human skull piece. And inside he could see some maggots still eating the flesh on the inside. And so he screams in terror, and him and Uisang run outside of the cave, and they're just afraid. That's it. And Wonhyo vomits on the ground. He just blah, and such. And then he straightens up, and suddenly he's got it. Suddenly he realizes, he understands. A flash of enlightenment comes to him. He says, I get it. It's all mind. It's all what we think it is. It's all our judgments. When we thought it was an ordinary cave, we were happy to stay there. When we saw there was dead bodies, we were afraid of ghosts, and we were terrified and disgusted. And when I drank the water, I thought it was okay. I was satisfied. But when I see it's dirty with it's tomb water and there's maggots there, then I'm disgusted and I vomit. These are all judgments made by our mind. And they had previously, as I said, studied the consciousness only or mind only philosophy coming from India, which emphasizes this whole particular point. And this reaches down deep in his brain, deep in his mind, to bring him a flash of total enlightenment. Now, in the whole history of enlightenment, as you know, if you've studied the Sun Buddhism, the great masters, enlightenment comes after many years of practice, can come from kind of anything, any random event that just shows you the light, sometimes in the very strangest of places or strangest of ways. You get that flash and you see it. Well, this was it for Wonhyo. It wasn't just the realization, that the kind of intellectual realization that you and me might have just listening to this or talking about it, to understand that, okay, the judgments of our mind, that's what makes us have these emotions, feelings. This is what causes the delusions and illusions of life. We've all heard this, and we might intellectually understand it, but for Wonhyo, getting it down deep, really getting it to the point where it really changes the way your mind works. This is enlightenment, and led to his great enlightenment for his life. Now, his friend his Doban Uisang, he notices something's going on with his friend Wonhyo, but then he looks out at the sea and he sees the ship coming. The ship is coming in to take him to China. He says, hey, the ship's here. Well, anyway, forget the tomb. Get your bags. Let's go. Go study in China with the great masters of all this new kind of Buddhism going on. And Wonhyo says, no, I don't want to go. I don't need to go. And Uisang says, oh, well, your face sure looks good. Your eyes, it looks like you've really attained something, but what? Aren't we going to go study? And Wonhyo says that the teachings of the Buddha have been revealed to him very directly of this. He's got the true perception, the direct perception. He says the Buddha Dharma is here in Korea, just as much as it is in China, just as much as it is in India. The Buddha Dharma, the truth of what the Buddha was teaching, is right here. And I got it here. I don't need to go to China. And Uisang says, okay, that's good for you, but I didn't get anything. And so I'm going to China. And Wonhyo says, okay, goodbye. And they separate for the first time. This forms a kind of a theme that happens several times during Korean history. There are several other examples of kind of pairings like this you can make between figures who go abroad, go to the foreign land, or go to at least a foreign source for foreign teachers here in Korea, or go to the other country to get some kind of teaching, knowledge, or enlightenment of some kind, and then bring it back home to Korea and bring it to the Korean people and spread to them, versus the kind of native soil geniuses, as they were, a few Koreans who study it just here by themselves and right here in Korea without a foreign teacher and without going to another country. They get it. They get something. And this could be a new kind of technology, or a realization of philosophy, or a religious thing. Anyway around. There are several examples we could bring up. The people on your money, the 1,000 won bill and the 5,000 won bill, are a good pair that demonstrates this. Yulguk on the 5,000 won bill, Confucian philosopher who studied the lineage of philosophers from China, was taught by the lineage and adopted the orthodox Chinese way of viewing and became a great philosopher with that. And Tege, the guy on the 1,000 won bill, who did the direct study here in Korea with no particular teacher, but studied it himself and got it by himself right here. He got Confucian enlightenment, shall we say, here, and became a great sage just by that. And others we could mention, but kind of a theme running through Korean history, and I think it still goes on today with the idea of some Koreans who might go to Harvard or Stanford or Europe and get the latest teachings, the new technology, and then bring it back to Korea, and they are a kind of a hero. You know, they're really serving the nation by doing this. Well, but there are some Koreans who, working with technology or some thing with the computers or ideas, who get it themselves right here without going overseas. And they are also a special kind of hero that benefits the nation. Both of these are very important. But it's understandable that the public loves the domestic genius the best. In public sentiment, they love the heroes who find their enlightenment, find their great achievement right here in Korea. By themselves with their own work and such. And so Wonhyo is the beloved one. And for other reasons too that we'll get to. But Wonhyo is the one who the public loves and venerates and respects so much. And so many things are named after him. Right here in Seoul, there's the Wonhyo Bridge and the Wonhyo Dong neighborhood, not too far from here in Yongsan, and Wonhyo buildings, several of them, and such, that he's a well-known, almost as much as King Sejong is loved by the public and respected, partly in just this beginning thing here, this story of him getting it right here and saying, hey, I don't need to go to China. The Buddha's truth is right here, just as much as it is anywhere. Okay? Now, this story, the story of Wonhyo&Uisang is very complicated, very complex. We go through different stages, okay? So you gotta stay with me. This would, in fact, make a great Hollywood movie, and I hope someday it will get made this way. We got to go back a little bit to why Uisang became a monk, okay? Backtrack a little bit. Back in the capital of Gyeongju, Uisang was a young nobleman. They were both born to fairly good middle-ranking families. But Uisang was a young nobleman who was studying for government office and is studying, to work for the government and work in public originally. He fell in love with a beautiful young girl whose name becomes known to us as Miehua, mysterious, Sunmyo. Right, Sunmyo. I keep mixing that up. She becomes known to us as Sunmyo, and we'll see about her a little later. A beautiful young woman. He falls in love with her. He wants to marry her. It's the idea. But she is selected as part of a tribute mission to China. Back in those days, Korea would send tribute gifts, native products and such, to the Emperor of China, and he would in turn send gifts back to Korea as part of their just diplomatic friendship. This continued for the next 1,000 years. In these days, young women were part of the tribute gifts. A few great beauties of the kingdom being sent to the Chinese court. Well, Sunmyo was selected to be sent as tribute to the capital of China. This broke Uisang's heart, that he couldn't have her, and this is how he resolved to be a Buddhist monk, then to give up the material world, give up the world of ordinary concerns, and he devote himself to Buddhist studies. And he became a monk for that reason. Now, on her way to China, being taken to China, Sunmyo was on the boat, was taken over to the Shandong Peninsula and then up the Yellow River, taken up an official boat of tribute up the Yellow River towards the capital of China. Halfway up the river, she decided she couldn't bear it, couldn't endure this fate of being separated from her lover, but instead given to the Chinese court. And so she decided to commit suicide and jumped off the boat into the river. And people in those days in East Asia did not know how to swim, hardly any, and so this would be suicide. However, she didn't die. She roiled on the waves and was tossed about and almost killed, but ended up washing up on a rock at the shore, and such, holding on and nearly dead. There was a rich man's house who often had a dock there, and often ships stopped there to convey information, and the rich man often hosted travelers passing to and fro to get information from them. And a servant from the rich man's house was down at the dock, and he saw this girl wash up on the shore, and he rescued her, brought her up to the house, and since she was a noblewoman from Shilla, he heard her sad story. She couldn't go home, because if she went home, she'd be executed for deserting the tribute mission. So the rich man adopted her like his own daughter and said, "You can stay here, live here, grow up as my daughter." So, all right. She did. She did not get married. She still remembered Uisang. Now, Uisang actually gets the ship over to the Shandong Peninsula after leaving from Wonhyo, okay? And this is 13 years after he first separated from Sunmyo, and he gets on the ship to go up the Yellow River, and that ship stops to spend the night at the house of the rich man, at that dock, and as the rich man hosts travelers to hear their information and maybe trade with them. So he goes to the house, and there is Sunmyo. She's there. And they both have these feelings for each other. Sunmyo confesses she still loves him. But Uisang says, "I'm a Buddhist monk, and I must hold to my Buddhist monk vow. I took the vows, I will follow my vows. That's the way I am. He's very strict. This is quite different from Wonhyo, as we'll see a little later. He will not break his vows. So it's a heartbreaking situation, but Sun Myo accepts this. She respects him as a monk and sticking to it. She says, well, you got to promise me one thing, that on your way back, after you finish your studies and you find enlightenment, no matter how long, how many decades it takes, you come back down the river, and on your way back to Korea, you visit me again. Let me see you one more time. And so Uisang agrees, okay, I will, I promise. Now then, stage 3 of our story. Uisang goes to, first of all, before we even get there, let me show you on this page the images so far of what we're talking about. This is the story of Wonhyo and Uisang and their Wonhyo's enlightenment. Famous. These kind of artworks are on temples all around Korea. And this is at the cave, and Uisang is standing by as Wonhyo with the skull there and reaching enlightenment at this. Here's another such small painting of them kind of outside the tomb, and he's with the skull drinking the water. It's a famous portrait of Wonhyo. This shows them again in a more quiet and contemplative, peaceful way, kind of considering the skull outside of the cave. This doesn't work. Use this. This showing Wonhyo in kind of an intuitive flash. This back here shows Uisang sleeping and Wonhyo drinking from the skull. This is more accurate to the actual story then. And then outside the cave, achieving enlightenment in view of the skull. This is a good one of Wonhyo dancing with delight as the sun is coming up. However, this is on the west coast, not the east coast, so the artist kind of got this wrong. This would be the sun setting, but it's supposed to be the sun rising, whatever, and Uisang saying goodbye. Another such painting, similar but somewhat different, very good, of Wonhyo dancing in delight and Uisang waving goodbye on his way to China. This is a more kind of pastel, simple thing of Wonhyo with the skull while Uisang sleeps and appearing on a lotus flower like he's already a Buddha. Different images of Wonhyo that are found around by various modern artists. This is a famous, in Japan, in the Koizanji Temple of Kyoto, the old capital of Japan. There's this portrait of Wonhyo. He's very famous in both Japan and China, well known, and one of the most famous paintings of Wonhyo here in Korea at the Bunwangsa Temple. And this is Wonhyo and Uisang together side by side. Wonhyo here, Uisang here. Wonhyo's a little older than Uisang in their later years, both of them as great masters. And a statue of Wonhyo right here in Seoul at Hyochang Park. Okay, now. Now, in part 3 of our story, Wonhyo gets up to China and studies with the greatest master of that time, a great good fortune. As I said, this Huayan Buddhism had origin, the Huayan school. It's in Sanskrit, this is called Avatamsaka. In English, that means flower garland or flower adornment. It's like a interwoven a wreath of flowers as if put around the neck of a great person, a famous person to adorn. It's a bit like the Hawaii custom of still putting a circle of flowers around a person's neck as an honored guest. Something. Now this refers to the intertwining, interpenetration of all things. This kind of Buddhism, now this is called Hwa-om Buddhism in Korea, so I'll refer to it from now on as Hwa-om. But this is flower garland or Avatamsaka or Chinese Huayan, in Japanese Kegon Buddhism, but in Korea, Hwaom Buddhism. All right, from now on. Now, the greatest master of Hwaom Buddhism at that time is Jian, Master Jian. And he adopted Uisang as his disciple. He had a dream in advance of this that's very significant. When Uisang showed up at his temple, thinking that he was just coming as an unknown monk from a foreign country, hoping he could be accepted, but when he came in, he found that Master Jian had already cleaned up the temple area and prepared to welcome a guest. And when Uisang walked in, Jian said, "Oh, so it's you. You have come here." And Uisang says, "Huh? What?" And he said, "Last night I had a big dream. I dreamed there was a giant tree growing from east of China, a land east of China. This would mean Korea, Shilla, the Shilla kingdom. A giant tree growing, a bayan tree, that then spread its branches and covered all of Northeast Asia with its branches. And in curiosity, I climbed up the trunk of the tree in the dream, climbed up the trunk, climbed through the branches. At the top of the tree, a nest of a sacred white crane, and in the nest was a jewel of enlightened understanding, like a pure diamond of enlightenment. And then I knew that a great sage was coming from the east. And then today you arrive at my temple. You are the guest I've been waiting for." And I'm sure this surprised Uisang very well, but he indeed proved himself quite a brilliant student. He became a Doban, also a Doban together with Master Fazang. Fazang was the top leading disciple of Master Jian, and after Master Jian died, Fazang became the next patriarch of this kind of Buddhism in China, and Fazang led it to its highest level of glory, where it was really the major kind of Buddhism in China, the Tang dynasty of that time, and left a great, profound legacy. He became good friends with this Master Fazang, the top disciple, and they spent the rest of their lives, they corresponded with each other and helped each other out, although they didn't meet face to face again. So he studied under Master Jian, and very quickly, in just 7 years, he seemed to really understand this kind of Buddhism. This might take, most students would spend 20 or 30 years studying, memorizing the sutra or something to get to the stage where they would really be said to be ready to be a master, to be enlightened in this kind of Buddhism. But in just 7 years, Uisang has got it fixed where he seems ready to graduate. And so Master Jian asks Uisang to prepare a summary of this teaching. What do you understand that I have taught you? What is the understanding of this Hwaom Buddhism? And Uisang sits in his room for weeks of hardly eating or sleeping, but writing, and produces 10 volumes. Not as big as the volumes we have today, but 10 scrolls, let's say, worth 10 volumes of books summarizing the Hwaom philosophy. And he presents this to his master, Jian. This is very much like getting your PhD, and this is like his PhD thesis that he's handing in to his leading professor in this scholastic style of Buddhism. It's largely the same as being a graduate student, really. And he presents this, and his master reads through it all, and he says, "No, you haven't got it. Yeah, you haven't got this. It's too wordy, too much. You're beating around the bush." And remember, Chinese like things summarized. They're very, very different from India. They want things shorter and punchier and to the point. He says that this is too much explaining around. You don't really have the essence of it. So Uisang destroyed those volumes, and he sat in his room then for 3 days and 3 nights without eating, without sleeping, and writing intensively and trying to shrink it down, condense it, get it right, and produces one volume of summarizing the entire Hwaom philosophy, which is originally hundreds of volumes of work. And then he gives this to Master Jian. Gives this as one volume. And Master Jian looks through it and he says, still no, you still don't quite have the core of it. Not quite. And in frustration, different stories, one says Uisang did it, the other one says Jian did it, different sources, threw the book into the fire, the volume. Just throw it in the fire and say, okay, the hell with it, be done. And they watch it burn, but then not all of the book burns. There's a few slips of paper in there that don't burn. Mysteriously, miraculously, they're in the fire with the coals, but it just doesn't burn. So Uisang takes a stick and fishes out those small pieces of paper. It turns out there's 210 Chinese characters in total on those pieces of paper. His master Jian collects them together, hands them to Uisang and says, okay, use these. Use just these 210 characters and put together a summation. Uisang goes back to his room, 3 days and 3 nights of fasting and working, and he creates this diagram, what's called the Ilsung Bobgedo, the Dharmadhatu diagram, which summarizes in 210 characters in a spiralic shape, making kind of an endless poem. There are 30 lines of 7 characters each to make 210, and the end of each poem connects to the beginning of the next one in a spiralic kind of mandala shape that's a bit like a swastika, and goes through, and in these 30-line poem summarizes the philosophy of the Avatamsaka. He presents this to his master, and his master says, looks at that diagram and said, yes, you got it. This is it. This is the key understanding. And this becomes Uisang's graduation. I have this from the Hwaomsa temple here in Korea. They sell this as a souvenir, as a good itself. They're very proud of this diagram of Uisang. There is no original copy left in Korea, but it's been much reproduced. And this is the actual diagram with the Chinese characters and various sacred symbols around the edges. And they still treasure this very much at the Hwaomsa temple and the other temples of Uisang's lineage. I'll kind of pass this around, I guess, so you can have a look at it yourselves personally going through. But this is the story of how this was made. Later, when Uisang comes back to Korea, he brings with him a copy of this diagram that he made, essentially his PhD thesis, and with an explanation underneath it, a little essay explaining how it was made and what it means, the larger explication of it, a short essay. This becomes a key document in Korean Buddhism, and still is. Still today in the monastic college of the Jogye order, when people are studying to become a monk, or even the Taego order, this is a text that is used, something that is studied, the original diagram, Uisang's explanation of it, and then later masters wrote commentaries on this diagram, in particular Master Gihwa, at the beginning of the Goryeo dynasty, the second golden age of Korea. They reestablished this Hwaom Buddhism as one of the key major kinds of Korean Buddhism, side by side with the Sun sect, which had become very powerful by then. And this Giwa wrote a commentary on this diagram, which remains today the standard commentary, a standard way to understand this, and is studied in the monastic colleges. So this really brings to a mainstream line of Korean Buddhist philosophy. This is the design itself, and then the various characters reproduced. And there's an explanation on this. The main point of this kind of philosophy, this Hwaom philosophy, is how everything is connected together. This kind of Buddhism is where we get, in English, the common terms of like all is one and one is all. it comes from this kind of Buddhism, not originally from Zen, as many people think it is, but that everything is interconnected to each other, and everything reflects everything else. That from one small bit element in the universe, you can see a reflection of everything else in the universe. And everything in the universe is really one great organism. And it is originally enlightened. That enlightenment pervades every aspect of the universe and is reflected from every aspect of the universe to each other. It is all originally enlightened, and it is only delusions and illusions that stop some sentient beings from seeing that and behaving accordingly. But really, all is one is all, is the ultimate truth. And this is expressed in this diagram and in this Wonhyo philosophy centered on it. This very small book here, the only book in English that is so far really been published about this. Dongguk University is working on another book of Master Giwa's commentary. So you get the diagram itself and Uisang's explanation, and then Master Giwa's commentary on that with explanation of his commentary, all in English, and maybe that'll be out by next year. I have been working as one of the editors of that new book, and it's about halfway done as far as I know, and maybe by next year it can be published, and this will be really something good to bring this into English for full understanding. Now, if we will, okay, that's part 3 of the story. Part 4 is that just upon his graduation, and as he is now certified as a master of this Wonhyo Buddhism and is starting to teach in China, the emperor of China detains and kidnaps 2 Korean ambassadors who had come over to question the relations with China because things had been getting tense, and the Tang emperor detained them, and word got passed to Master Uisang that Tang Dynasty was planning to attack Korea. There would be an invasion in 670. This is at the end of the Unification Wars, and this did happen. The invasion did happen, and that Kim Yushin and his son, the son of famous General Kim Yushin, fought off the Chinese invasion and forced them to go back home. So this did happen, and Uisang wanted then to warn his home country. So he asked his master and the government for permission to go back to Shilla, having finished his studies, and he was given permission, and he came back to Shilla to give warning to the king that the Chinese were going to attack. And he did so. So he's rewarded for his patriotism, loyalty, and especially rewarded by King Munmu for bringing this kind of Buddhism, being a certified master of this new Wonhyo Buddhism here in Korea. And he was given power and authority by the king in a way that Wonhyo never really was, but given authority to establish temples, given the money and the people, the personnel with which to do so. Now, further part of our story, to get to part 5, the Uisang, after he was enlightened and going to go back to Korea, he'd made a promise, remember? He promised the girl Sun Myo that he would stop by. He came back to that rich man's house on the river and found that for the last 7 years, Sun Myo had been embroidering a silk monk's robe, a master's robe, because she was sure that Uisang would reach enlightenment and become a master. And so a very fancy embroidered silk robe of the kind that a great master of Buddhism would wear. She'd been embroidering that for him, making that for him, as a token of her love and her respect and her acceptance that he would continue to be a Buddhist monk and not her husband. She was waiting there at the house with the robe. Uisang spent the night. She was planning to get up in the morning and say goodbye and see them off and give him the robe. Uisang seemingly couldn't face this tearful goodbye, this emotional difficulties, Uisang decided to get up very early, 4 a.m. in the morning, and take off early without saying goodbye. Sort of an illegal midnight run. But these matters of the heart, even for an enlightened master, are very difficult. And he took off down the river. Miaohua from her adopted father, got a boat and chased him down the river to the Shandong Peninsula, where the cliffs overlooking Yantai Port are there, and Uisang's ship. Uisang got there first and got on the ship. Miaohua, Sun Miao coming up behind him with her embroidered robe, still intending to give it to him, but his ship left the dock and was already sailing. She went up on top of the cliff and in her great despair threw the robe at the ship, and then, feeling totally empty and despair inside, jumped off the cliff after it, again committing suicide for the second time. And she prayed that she could be a protector and a guardian for Uisang by sacrificing herself. And indeed, she fell on top of her own embroidered master's robe and hit the water and such, and was killed, but then instantly reincarnated as a dragon. Sun Miao becomes a dragon and becomes a protective guardian for Uisang, follows his ship across the Yellow Sea. A storm comes up threatening to sink the ship, which frequently happened on the Yellow Sea. Was very dangerous waters in those days, but the dragon managed to steady and save the ship, got it into port, and as Uisang went to the capital, the dragon following him in the clouds as his guardian. This leads us then to one of the most famous temples in Korea, the Busoksa. Have I opened that yet? Okay. The Taebaeksan Busoksa. Uisang, again, was given money, given power by the king to establish the great temples to promote his kind of Buddhism. He came to, first of all, the first place went in 676 AD, so he'd been in the capital city about 5 years, set out on an expedition up north, went to Taebaeksan, already one of the holiest mountains of the nation. For since ancient times of the Shilla kingdom, Taebaeksan had been their north holy mountain, sacred mountain, and was already a site of heavy mountain worshipping activities by the native people of Shilla, many of whom were still not adopting Buddhism yet. Many of the common people still practicing their folk shamanism and worshiping the mountain spirits primarily. He came up there and he found a mountain worshipping site that he thought was perfect to make his temple. And he said, we will establish the great Buddhist temple here. The common people actually rose in revolt against him and protested. There was a mob, essentially, a mob of local people who came up and said, no, you will not build a temple here. This is a sacred site for worshiping the mountain spirit, and you have this foreign religion, this imported thing, Buddhism. We don't want this. There's a theme throughout Korean history of resisting the new religions as they come in. And what happened then is the dragon, Sun Miao the dragon, lifts up a giant boulder and holds it above the people to threaten them to give up and permit the temple here we go. This rather extraordinary painting shows a rather angry and threatening Uisang, and this boulder, this giant rock here, is held up by the dragon over the people and threatening them in this way, threatening to smash them, to crush them. The people are scattered, and then they bow down, they give up and say, okay, the power of the Buddha is strongest, and they give up to admit to establish this temple. This is the floating rock itself. This boulder here, this is it, the actual one, and it has characters carved on it. It says Busak, floating rock, rock that floated in the sky. Supposedly Master Uisang himself wrote these characters. Now, this temple has many fascinating aspects. It's one of the most beautiful and profound temples in Korea, and with many great features, but we haven't got time to go into them. At this temple, there's several national treasures, such as this clay Buddha in the main hall, and the main hall remaining here is the oldest building in Korea. It's said to be built upon Sunmyo's bones, that the dragon, after doing the trick with the rock, the dragon settled down on the plateau of the cliff, the flat place, settled in and sank into the earth, and that the dragon's bones essentially remaining, that the temple main hall was built on top of them. And monks still tell you that today when you visit there, that this hall is built on the bones of the dragon. And it is now the oldest wooden building in Korea, the Muryang-Sujung worship hall for Amita Buddha, which is, it means the infinite long life hall itself. It is now more than 600 years old, and the oldest wooden building we have remaining in the nation. And it's a very appropriate and certainly well protected function. It's very famous. This building itself, this is outside. This is a pagoda for Uisang's remains, supposedly, and here it is a beautiful temple with many great relics. And behind it, because of this story, behind that main hall I just showed you, the oldest building in Korea, is a special shrine for Sunmyo. The Sunmyo Gak, a shrine for her as the dragon, as Uisang's wannabe girlfriend, is enshrined here behind the main hall of the greatest temple that he established. This is her portrait in the hall, Sunmyo Gak. A very mysterious thing, kind of a quirk. This is her, this is the girl who was sent to China, and she's holding the box here with the embroidered monk's robe that she made is contained in this box, and you see around her a dragon in the clouds, the dragon that she became. That story again, the floating rock itself, and the characters carved by Uisang. Back behind this temple, more, oops, let me take this back, is the Josadang, the founder's hall for Uisang. This building, again, a national treasure in itself, one of the most famous buildings in Korean Buddhism. A Josadang means, Josa is a founding teacher, and Uisang is called Uisang Josa for that matter. Wonhyo is called Desa, a great master, great teacher. He is Uisang Josa, founding master. And in it is this statue of Uisang and portrait of him doing his master teaching activities. Other great masters were served at that temple, and at the side there's another portrait of Sunmyo in that shrine. Also very interesting here, this you can barely see, there's a tree inside of here. Supposedly after Master Uisang died and they established this Josadang for him, monks took his old master staff, the wooden staff, and leaned it, stood it on the porch, just leaning against the building. The master's staff then sprouted roots and then shoots and grew into a tree, growing roots right into the stone foundation of the shrine That's what they say, anyway. They claim that this tree here is then more than 1,200 years old and is just a spindly thing in this metal cage they've put to protect it, because Korean people keep wanting to break off branches or leaves of the tree as a souvenir because it is considered so miraculous and powerful. It's Taege Huang, the master of Confucianism, who's on the 1001 bill, is known to have visited here and sat here at the Josadang shrine and wrote a poem about this tree, which still exists and is a well-known poem of Korean literature. So, now, running short on time, but to turn to Master Wonhyo, a very different sort of a person. Well, I'll summarize with Master Uisang by saying he was very strict. He followed this one style of Buddhism, this Hwa-Um Buddhism, and very strictly implemented it. It was known as a bit of a harsh teacher. He was very demanded exact discipline from his students and hard study, but was very good at it, a very skilled master. By the time he died, he had 3,000 disciples under him studying this Hwa-Um Buddhism, and he had successfully in one generation established it as one of the major kinds of Korean Buddhism. Out of these 3,000 disciples, 10 disciples became major masters of that kind of Buddhism, 10 main disciples, and together between Uisang himself and these 10 disciples, they founded 10 great temples around Korea to promote this kind of Buddhism. 6 of those still exist and are some of the greatest temples in Korea still. This Busoksa right here, Gyasan Haeinsa, which is virtually the Vatican of Korean Buddhism these days. The Jirisan Hwaomsa, the greatest ancient temple down at Jirisan, our greatest sacred mountain, and Bomasa in Busan as Gumsansa over at Moaksan near Jeonju. These were deliberately 10 great temples built in Shilla Kingdom, but also in the other kingdoms, in the former Goguryeo area and in the former Baekje area, to help unify the nation, to put these temples in the former enemy territories and make them as great monasteries for this new unifying kind of Buddhism. Master Wonhyo, in contrast, is very famous as a free thinker and a person of free activity. He, after achieving his enlightenment, returning to the capital, turned himself to scholarship and lecturing, and became a great commentator on the Buddhist sutras and scriptures. Kind of a genius intellectual figure who wrote some commentaries on the Buddhist scriptures that themselves became very standard Buddhist scriptures accepted. He is known as one of the great geniuses of East Asian Buddhism. Some of the commentaries he wrote were recopied and sent to Japan and China, where they became heavily studied and accepted as some of the very best of the commentaries. He studied this Hwa-Um Buddhism that his friend Uisang brought back from China once he returned, but then other kinds of Buddhism. And Wonhyo was more of a unified thinker, trying to bring all kinds of Buddhism together and stop the disputing between the schools. Uisang was intending to do this also, but Uisang was doing it by choosing one particular kind of Buddhism, indeed a kind of grand and overarching philosophical school of Buddhism, and saying this is the one true way, this is the best kind of Buddhism, and establishing that and getting thousands of monks to just study that type and accept that. Wonhyo was much more a guy to take all the different scriptures, all different schools of Buddhism, study them, and try to show that they all had basically the same meaning, the same fundamental base. of understanding, the sort of thing that he had realized first at the beginning out there on the coast of Dangjin, saying that the Buddha's truth is the same everywhere, and it's just expressed differently in these different schools, but it's the same Buddha Dharma truth that is being expressed. And he said that you just have to study, you have to understand each different school, each different way of philosophy of how they are expressing the one single truth. His philosophical achievements were really supreme. He wrote perhaps somewhere between 80 and 100 works. We're not sure, but we think between 80 and 100 different books or works or treatises on Buddhism, of which we have something like 23 that either partially or completely still exist. 23 different works. And 3 of those are regarded as if written by a bodhisattva. They're judged by later generations of Buddhists to be so excellent that they are given the title of an actual scripture, not just a commentary by a master, but a scripture as if spoken by a bodhisattva himself. He's one of only 3 Buddhists in East Asia, in the two from China, and the Wonhyo himself, to be ever given that distinction that something he wrote was accepted as a bodhisattva scripture. So still today, within the Buddhist studies of China and Japan, he is very much still studied by professors. There are probably more academic papers in Buddhist journals and books being written, including in the United States, more about Wonhyo than any other figure of Korean Buddhism, certainly, and as much as any figure of East Asian Buddhism altogether. I'm sure he's one of the very top of that, of just how many people choose to study him and write something about some aspect. He is still regarded as one of the greatest geniuses. But at the same time, he's very much a man of freedom and spontaneity. Opposite and different from Uisang, he did not build his own great school. He's regarded as founder of a sect that he called the Haedong sect, meaning just east of the sea, in other words, the Korea sect of Buddhism, but it didn't really survive much after him. He wasn't the type to have formal disciples. We don't know names of actual disciples of Wonhyo. He taught many people all over the place, but didn't really have a formal structure going, as Uisang did, building a large formal structure that lasted for hundreds of years after him. Wonhyo was just kind of going from place to place, teaching whoever he could, and sometimes being invited to the king to lecture to 1,000 monks at a time, sometimes staying in a temple doing a series of formal lectures, but then would leave and go on his way. He tended to roam around the country, doing as he wished, going as he wished. He got a reputation as just a free acting man without discipline, and often seeming to violate the Buddhist precepts, violated the rules. But being regarded as a living Buddha, people said, well, that's okay, that's Wonhyo, he can do that. In particular, the most famous story, he had a sex affair with a princess, which is, again, would be a great part of our Hollywood movie if we could make about these guys. The story of how this generated, there's 2 different sources. In the Samguk-yusa, you know the Samguk-yusa, the basic compilation of the old myths and legends of Korea from the 1200s. In that version, they're rather just blunt that Wonhyo had some desire. He felt a sexual desire when he was about between 50 to 60 years old. He finally felt that he wanted to do that. And he fixed his attentions upon a widowed princess known as Yosok. Princess Yosok, who had a young, beautiful princess girl. She had been married to a Hwarang fighter, and he was in the war, and her husband was killed. So she was left as a widow, and she had never had a child. The Samguk-yusa shows that kind of Wonhyo having the idea and fixating upon her. On the other, the hagiography called the Lives of Eminent Monks that was compiled in the Goryeo dynasty, they have a more roundabout story that Princess Yusuk fell in love with Wonhyo and that she enticed him into the affair. She insisted upon it, saying that she would die of heartbreak if he wouldn't spend some time with her, and then asking Wonhyo, if I'm going to die, if you won't make love with me, then if you won't do it, then you're killing me, right? And doesn't that break your monastic vows if you're causing the death of a person? And Wonhyo having to think about it and saying, well, yeah, I guess if you're going to die if I don't do it with you, then I suppose that I would be guilty of a crime, so I might as well do it with you. I'm putting it that way. The Samguk-yusa shows more of being Wonhyo's idea, but he is recorded in both versions of ending up that Wonhyo goes in front of the palace, walking in front of the palace through the town of Gyeongju, singing a limerick, kind of a dirty song, a little children's song with a dirty meaning to it about wanting to father a child that would end up as a heaven-supporting pillar, a great figure. And the king hearing about this, and the king being outraged at first, he's talking about my daughter. What? But then thinking again that, well, this is Wonhyo, and he's a great master and enlightened. He's a living Buddha. And so if he wants something, it must be a proper thing, even if it's against the rules for monks and against social propriety. What can we do? So either way, the king ends up arranging this visit, and in the detached palace where the widowed princesses live, Wonhyo is introduced there and spends 2 weeks, spends a fortnight there together with the princess. Must have been a good time since he'd been saving it up for 50 years. And he then left, he leaves her and never comes back. She becomes pregnant and has a baby boy who's known to us as Sul-chung, who grows up and becomes a great Confucian scholar of the Shilla kingdom. And this is kind of ironic that Wonhyo-san does not grow up to be a Buddhist, but becomes a Confucian scholar working for the government and ends up making some great achievements in Korean linguistics and scholarship, and is known as one of Korea's greatest Confucian figures. He's enshrined in the National Confucian Shrine, downtown Seoul, right here. So, this is Wonhyo's son. I almost imagine a little resentment from the boy maybe growing up, the boy being 7 years old and wondering, where's my daddy? Where's my father? The other kids have a father, and the princess is saying, yeah, your father, a great enlightened Buddha, he's off teaching the people. And so the little boy turns to Confucianism rather than Buddhism, perhaps, maybe. Wonhyo, from there, retreats to a temple north of Seoul here and does penance, does a couple of years of meditation in a hermitage just north of here in Donggucheon City at Soyosan, and repents of his breaking the monastic vows, or perhaps just clearing his mind to take a rest after that adventure. And then he proclaims himself a layman. He takes off his monk's robes, calls himself a no-account layman. He takes the name of that and wanders around the country teaching common people. He gives up totally his royal, aristocratic kind of life, his privileges as a great master, his recognition, and he goes around teaching the common people, drumming on a gourd, wearing a big pair of baggy pants, which on the back of his pants he writes Chinese characters that say "no obstacle," and showing by this his disregard for convention. And he becomes famous for wandering through villages, entertaining the people by singing and dancing, becoming close with them, but then teaching them a very simple kind of Pure Land Buddhism, the worship of Amitabha for going to the Western Paradise, Pure Land, a very simple Buddhism that the common people can understand. People who are illiterate, cannot read and write, and cannot benefit from the regular Buddhism. So even though Wonhyo is this great intellectual genius scholar, he's out there drinking with the farmers. He's recorded being in taverns, visiting brothels, visiting military camps with the common people, the low-class people, and teaching them a very simple kind of Buddhism out of just a kind of love and compassion for the common man. So this is, you can see the contrast between the two men, with Uisang as very strict and very kind of aristocratic and a great master. He would never be caught in a village brothel or something, always a man of luxurious robes and great dignity, where Wonhyo was this free thinker. There are many stories of them together, which I don't have time to relate to you today, but they can be found in the Samguk-yusa and in the other records of Korean Buddhism that do exist, that you can find, of them together side by side in their later years, having various kinds of adventures, either encountering deities or philosophical revelations, or just in the ways that they taught the monks underneath them, showing their contrasting characters. They're still always in these stories, these are very different kinds of people, yet they love each other, they work together, and as a unity together, really, they make the character of Korean Buddhism as it is today. Uisang's, again, the Hwa-om Buddhism remains right through the Goryeo dynasty, a very powerful intellectual force, a kind of scholastic Buddhism that is the leader. It becomes the rival of the Zen school, or Sun Buddhism. And Wonhyo, his commentaries on the sutras are thought to be part of the foundation of leading towards the Sun Buddhism. As it developed and came from China and became a Korean thing here, Wonhyo's philosophy helped point the way towards that way of understanding. So they both become kind of the twin threads of Korean Buddhism coming up through, and still today are both heavily studied as the real characteristic root and flowering of Korean Buddhist thinking. Both of them different, contrasting, but both essential, and both really necessary to each other. Without the one side of that kind of Buddhism, the strict formality, and the free thinking, living Buddha kind of spontaneity, both of those, neither one could exist without the other. And we should see them as a unity. I would conclude with just saying, what does this different pair, these two of them, what can that mean for us, for our practice, for our approach to Buddhism, and allowing a certain freedom of range between the different characters, between the strictness, the formality of study, and between spontaneous free action, going with what you feel is right in your particular situation. That both of those, employed in a balance, can be the best way to move forward in terms, or in a balance that either one of them followed too much without any balance would lead to a false pathway, perhaps, but within a context of harmonious interaction between those two types, perhaps it can work. And just with both Wonhyo and Uisang, they both followed their own character, their own way. They're following their heart to be their own kind of Buddhist adept and find the truth in their own way. And each one of them did that successfully, even though in different ways. So we can perhaps take a lesson from that. Thank you.
We have running out of time, but if you want to ask a question, very briefly, you can.
Sure, I'd like to make a comment, because when you talk about Wonhyo, there's one thing that you cannot ignore, which is he was Yukdupung, which was in the class society. He was born with limitations. Otherwise, Uisang is Chenggol, so he was a royal family. It's just like in India, the caste. So Wonhyo was born with that, and his uncle actually abandoned Silla to go to town because of that class limitations. So that's why Wonhyo became such a revolutionary, and he came down to the people, because back then the class in Silla dynasty is even more stricter than Goryeo and Chosun. Right? So
True.
that's why their practice differed so much. And another thing is Wonhyo Seolchong never resented his father. He had a great respect for his father. Wonhyo mastered Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, everything. He was a genius, like you said. And Seolchong and Uisang actually had a great respect, and they followed around. And Seolchong did a lot of study. That's why there is this huge story about Seolchong actually making a statue out of his bones at the
When Wonhyo died.
Yeah, so
This is true.
So that's why I see it as an American mentality. You see a son who's abandoned, resenting the father, but that's totally not in this.
My own speculation, it's true. But we don't have records of Seolchong as a child and what he thought or what he would have done. When his father died, he did respect his father and enshrine him in a Buddhist temple with a statue. That is true. We do know that, but
he had a lot of stories telling how he was like reading his books loudly enough so that his father across the temple could hear it. And then
well, these are folk tales, not exactly.
Yeah, but everything else is also
fact.
based in folk tales.
Well, they're stories.
It's just, I don't know. I'm making a documentary about Master Wonhyo, and there was a lot of misunderstanding about Wonhyo. That's why he's not properly recognized in this world. And here in Turkey-sa, we should teach the right thing, and
There's a wide variety of things written about him already, all kinds of interpretation. Part of what you mentioned as like a revolutionary, I mean, the idea that Wonhyo taking the Buddhism to the common people, which was nothing against really the powers of that time. It's nothing about overthrowing the established order. But I remember in the 1980s and early 90s, when we had the leftist revolution here for, the democracy movement, and on college campuses, the kids were studying Marxism and demanding the overthrow of Korea's dictatorship and all that. Wonhyo was a hero figure to them, this Minjung movement, as it was called, because he had stooped to bring Buddhism, to bring comfort to the common people, the people in the villages and such. He was seen as kind of a hero, as at least a middle-class person who had gone to do that, to work with the commoners instead of just this aristocratic attitude. So that became a whole theme back then, though I don't know what people think of that idea today. But it's true, there's so many different interpretations you could take, and people have taken so many different angles on it. It's quite so.
Okay. Thank you very much for your excellent lecture. I don't know how much you have learned, you have known about Korean Buddhism, but maybe not all of you understand enough about the history of our Korean Buddhism, but he was quite excellent in explaining the deep stories and the good understanding of the two great figures in early Korean Buddhism to you. So why don't you give a clap to him for his Personally, I was this is his second time to give a talk here. So we will have another time in December. But for these two talks, he impressed me very, very much with his passion for Korean Buddhism. I think in some part it is much more knowledgeable about Korean Buddhism. Some stories uncovered yet, so to my understanding. Okay. Thank you very much. I hope to see you next time for sure. And in closing our Dhamma talk, I want to stand up and face Buddha.